Welcome to Question Period on this Sunday, January 18th. I'm Vassy Kapelos. Today, New Year, New World Disorder.
We're doing great against China. We're doing great against everybody. We're the hottest country anywhere in the world.
2026 is off to a chaotic start on the world stage, and in many cases, the U.S. president is the driving force.
Canada's forging a new strategic partnership.
In the face of tectonic trade actions by Donald Trump, Canada and China are resetting relations and aiming to boost bilateral trade.
Greenland belongs to its people.
And as the U.S. president revives his threat to annex the autonomous territory, Denmark and European allies are surging troops to Greenland. We've got you covered on both of these major stories. First, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe will be here with his review of the deal with China. Then, the former Canadian diplomat detained by China, Michael Kovrig, tells us how he is reflecting on the relationship reset. Plus, the Sunday strategy session stands ready to dissect the domestic political implications, and ambassadors from Germany, France, and the UK will be here together to weigh in on Donald Trump's coveting of Greenland. We begin our first show of the new year today with the significant and controversial Canada-China relationship reset.
Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs. We're building a web of new connections with China to create transformative opportunities for Canadian workers, build more stability, more certainty, and prosperity on both sides of the Pacific.
During a trip to China this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his senior cabinet officials secured a resolution to the long-standing bilateral trade spat. Beijing is significantly lowering its tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products, and in exchange, Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at a marginal tariff rate. The deal, though, has big domestic implications. Ontario is slamming it as a mess that will jeopardize the province's already beleaguered auto industry.
This was not thought out properly. It wasn't consulted. It was a knee-jerk reaction as far as I'm concerned, and this is going to be a big problem.
The prairie provinces, meanwhile, are celebrating the much-needed relief for their agricultural industries. Scott Moe is Premier of Saskatchewan. He was on the trip with the Prime Minister and joins us from Beijing. Hi, Premier. Good to see you as always. Welcome back to the program. Thanks for making the time.
Well, thank you, Vassy, for you making the time as well.
I know it's late where you are. I wanted to start off on the agreement reached where tariffs is concerned and ask you quite plainly, what message, Premier, you think it sends China that Canada did what China wanted and lifted those EV tariffs?
They didn't. The EV tariffs are still in place. There's a small quota of tariffs that of a number of EVs that will be allowed to come to Canada with a lower tariff level. And really what this is doing is, I think step one is returning us to a trade environment that we had, let's say a year ago, where agricultural products are able to enter the Chinese market with a low or no tariff environment. And two, with the number of MOUs that were signed, really provides the building blocks for us to expand our export opportunities and some of the, the strategic partnership opportunities that we might be able to aspire to with not only China, but a number of Asian countries through China.
I guess why I framed the question the way I did, though, and I take your point on the quota, it is a marked change on EVs from what existed before. And the way that, the ambassador a few months on this program put it was, if you do this, we'll do that. That's what the federal government ended up doing. What precedent does that set the next time China is unhappy with something Canada has done?
It's 49,000 EVs. That's about what was imported into Canada last year. It's less than 3% of our auto market. And in exchange for that, we are able to have access for literally billions and billions of dollars of various agricultural products, seafood products, and others. And so, as we find our way through, respecting some of the differences that China and Canada might have, but also working together to collaborate on the trade that was announced today, but also through the MOU, some of the opportunities that we'll have moving into the future. And I would say that some of those opportunities may be partnerships in the auto manufacturing space, much like we had to pivot or shift to 20 or 30 years ago when we were faced with a number of different manufacturers that were also looking to access the Canadian market.
Premier Ford in Ontario does not view the potential impact of that in the same way or as minimal as you are characterizing it. In fact, he says it puts in so many words, it puts the sector in his province at risk. China, in this instance, leveraged the fact that canola and agricultural products mean a lot to one part of the country, and the auto sector means a lot to another part of the country. They effectively pitted one part of the country against the other. If we have acquiesced, as it appears we have, what does that tell them, again, about the next time?
I actually disagree entirely with the framing of that question, Vassy. The agriculture industry, the canola industry, the oilseed industry, the pulse industry is important to virtually each and every part of this country, up to and including Ontario, and certainly many other provinces across Canada. Second to that, I would say that the foundation and the building blocks of this agreement provide tremendous opportunities for electrical partnerships, energy partnerships moving forward that will benefit provinces potentially like Newfoundland, for example, as well as some of the provinces like British Columbia that are producing LNG that is finding its way to the Chinese market as well, and there's opportunities for more of that to happen. Second to that, I would say that there's a changing environment in the manufacturing space, and this opens up a number of years for us as Canadians, whether it be in Ontario or other provinces, to engage on what our manufacturing future is going to look like, and to create some of the partnerships like we did 20 or 30 years ago with many of the manufacturing brands that are commonplace in manufacturing their vehicles in Canadian communities today, but were not 30 years ago.
When you flag the potential opportunity for example, for more cooperation and more investment from China on energy, I remember covering when the Harper government approved the CNOC-Nexen deal, and the degree to which after that they established a national security framework that would not permit something like that from happening again because of the risk that was assessed at the time, which federal governments since have actually assessed to be even greater from a national security perspective of China. Do you really think it's a good idea for China to end up owning more of our natural resources sector? Does that not put our country more at risk from a security perspective?
I think the conversation is important to have on how we expand our resource sector and other sectors and ensure that we are creating access to market, those products that we are producing that are providing, whether it be energy security or, in case of battery elements, that security for our energy future, or in the ag sector, our agricultural products as well, which provide food security to so many. But I would say a couple of things. The tone of the conversation that I saw here in Beijing this week was one is the most positive tone that I have seen in my time as Premier, which is nearing in on 8 years now. That is a good thing. It's also a tone that is very much respecting the differences that we might have between Canada and China, respecting those differences and moving forward where we are able to collaborate. And so I think it's a great day for Canadians, notwithstanding some discussions that I'm sure we'll have in the next number of days and weeks. But all in all, it is going to be a net positive to the Canadian economy and going to provide us some opportunities to really engage on what our future looks like over the next 5, 10, and 15 years.
And I certainly understand that point, and I ask with great respect, like the differences that you allude to are not minor, right? And the reason I ask about Chinese investment in critical sectors, for example, or strategic assets here in Canada, is I get wanting to sell them more LNG, more oil, more canola, more peas. I understand all of that. But when we allow China, who we know for a fact tried to interfere in our elections, we know for a fact supports regimes in Venezuela and Iran and in Russia, when we allow them more access to those strategic assets, is that not a national security risk? And can you understand Canadians who are watching this unfold with great trepidation?
there's some ownership portions that they have of some of the, the operating assets that we have in Canada today. And I would say that when you look more broadly at countries that we trade with around the world today, that environment certainly has changed, and changed significantly, in particular over the course of the past year, where we see the President of the United States that is resetting trade relations, not just with Canada, but with multiple countries all at the same time. And so we are in a very different environment. And it is important for, us at the subnational level, but more important for our federal government to be engaging with all countries that are important to us. And our second largest trading partner the last number of years as Canadians has been China. And so it's, I think, of vital importance for not only our Prime Minister, but we had a delegation of 6 ministers and the parliamentary secretary that were on the ground the last number of days here in China, been engaging the last number of months, and we welcome that. Not just with China, not just with the United States of America, but with many, many trading partners and countries around the world. And I would say this. The past number of months, we've seen this Prime Minister Carney, really elevate the Canadian credibility that we have in that international sphere of influence and trade influence. And we have always felt that needs to be a priority for a country, and we very much welcome the priority that Prime Minister Carney and the federal government is putting into that space as we speak. And I think we're seeing the fruition of some of that engagement with this agreement, which I think is foundational to the future of Canada today.
I'm going to leave it on that note. Premier, I appreciate your time as always, and very much that you stayed up so late for this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vassy.
Coming up, Trump takeover. U.S. President Donald Trump's hopes to acquire Greenland are causing widespread concern among allies. What could it mean for NATO? Ambassadors to Canada from Germany, the UK, and France will all be here together next to answer that question.
Discussions focus on how to ensure the long-term security in Greenland. And here our perspectives continue to differ, I must say. The President has made his view clear, and we have a different position.
Representatives of Denmark and Greenland visited Washington, D.C. this week for a high-stakes meeting at the White House. This as U.S. President Donald Trump continues to claim he, quote, needs Greenland for security reasons. And now he's threatening to tariff countries who oppose a U.S. takeover of the autonomous territory. The rhetoric has drawn widespread concern from European allies, some of whom are now sending troops to Greenland at the request of Denmark. Joining me is the UK High Commissioner to Canada, Rob Tinlune. Next to him, that's France's Ambassador to Canada, Michel, Miraillet. And next to him, that's Germany's Ambassador to Canada, Tjorven, Bellmann. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here all together. Thank you for making the time. Ambassador Bellmann, I'm going to start with you. Donald Trump this week stated that anything short of Greenland being in American or U.S. hands is, quote, unacceptable. What does that say to you?
I think that all of our governments have been very clear on defending territorial integrity and the right to self-determination. So we've said very clearly that, it's only for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark to decide on matters for regarding Greenland, the Kingdom of Denmark. At the same time, it is clear that there are concerns in D.C. regarding Arctic security, something we take very seriously as well. So for us, what it means that we have to work now towards finding answers to that, to finding a solution. This is why the German foreign minister was in D.C. At the beginning of this week. This is why we've put proposals on the table in NATO to see whether the alliance can have more of a presence. It's why we have deployed our soldiers to Greenland as part of the exercise Arctic Endurance. And we want to be constructive and bring this to a solution that respects territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Ambassador Miraillet, is it your impression that there is a solution that could be qualified as constructive to be had where where the concerns of Trump in the Arctic are?
Well, I would say that if I stick to what we heard about, the meetings between the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs and Mr. Vance and the Secretary of State, I think that we need to give time to time. Greenland is a cornerstone of two issues, fundamental issues for NATO and for the European Union. First of all is the security in the North Atlantic, and on the other hand, the respect of the sovereignty of countries, member of the alliance, but also member of the European Union. So I think that, we need to calm down this whole issue. I mean, in a sense, it's a family affairs, and there's nothing worse than family affairs. I mean, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre was used to say, "Family, I hate you." But I think that it's not the first crisis we see within NATO. I mean, we have encountered that in 2003. I think that there's a unanimity between leaders to remind, I mean, the United States that, I mean, as a democratic country, I mean, they need to stick to the independence and compromise with the. We are uncompromising with the national sovereignty of our partners.
Do you think, High Commissioner, that the temperature can be turned down? And I think under most circumstances, it would be understandable that it could be, given the posture of NATO allies in relation to the kinds of things President Trump is talking about. But every time a solution or even the proposition of turning the temperature down is put to the president or one of his delegates, they appear to be even more emphatic in their rhetoric about their desire to acquire Greenland.
So look, we're doing fundamentally two things. The Dane and the Greenland foreign ministers were clearly in the White House this week talking to their American counterparts and Vice President Vance. Those conversations are continuing. You saw them come out and say there's a process to continue those conversations, and obviously all of our countries continue to talk to the US and other allies. Alongside that, you're seeing increased investment in security in the High North, and that isn't this week or this month. That's been going on for some time. 2014, we launched the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a group of 10 countries from the Nordics, the Baltics, and the UK, to try and look at how we do High North security better. Just this, at the moment, we've got 1,500 Royal Marines in Norway. On an exercise as part of NATO. So there's a lot of discussion going on about how we can take forward the questions around Greenland, but there's also a lot of effort going into how we can support better security in the High North, and that's been happening for some time, but obviously we're now looking at how we can step it up further to meet those concerns.
I guess what I sort of garner from what all three of you have said, if I'm to arrive at something, it's that, you know, if there is sort of the right amount of attention, investment, and focus placed on the concerns that Donald Trump and the United States have expressed around Arctic sovereignty, Arctic security, where Greenland is concerned, that maybe he can be talked down from his position. Do you think that is true, Ambassador?
I wouldn't use these words, but what we are certainly doing is trying to focus on such a process in order to come to a joint agreement on how we collectively can do more as an alliance in order to secure that the High North and the Arctic stay safe and our deterrence holds. So I think this is something that is in the interest of all of us. The US, as you know, already has a very extensive defense treaty stemming from 1951, which and used to have much more troop deployments during the Cold War. So there is already a broad basis between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US to work on, and I know that our Danish friends are all ready for it. They've invested a lot in Arctic security in these past years, and I think we will continue to work on this and try to find solutions.
The president is also just very recently, Ambassador, saying or threatening to tariff any country that opposes the US acquiring Greenland. To be clear, does your country oppose it, and how do you respond to that threat?
We will see. I mean, it's part of the game for the moment. One more time, what we are expecting is to see the whole thing slowing down. And I'm confident in the impact of leaders, European leaders. I mean, what their message to the American political circles. You know, for the moment, when you look at some polls, you see that 75% of the Americans are against this issue. At the end of the day, this may have an impact in the perception of the midterms. I mean, so I mean, there's a lot of elements around this issue. we will have to look at that. I mean, I cross my fingers, I must say. But
even to your point, though, even Republican politicians, it's one of the few issues that they are publicly going on, you know, on media outlets, et cetera, to speak out against the
and
president.
There was this mission today in Greenland.
Yes, yes, and I guess the question I have is, you know, despite all of that, despite the uniqueness of the situation and the pushback to it, the lack of public support, the president continues to employ the rhetoric he does. And I know often sometimes that rhetoric doesn't necessarily match the actions, High Commissioner, but in this case, he has not shown any signs of abatement.
So look, our job is to work through the issues. It's not to predict where it might go. You know, the president clearly has a position that he set out very clearly. As I say, we're working through that with allies, with the US. We're very clear that the future of Denmark is future of Greenland is for the people of Denmark and Greenland to decide. But you know, we can do more on High North security, and we are doing more on High North security, and we'll continue to discuss in NATO and as partners how we can do that, while we keep those conversations with the US and others going to see where the future takes us.
I'll just follow up quickly with you, High Commissioner, and ask more largely about NATO. I think one of the reasons, among many I should say, but one of the reasons why this is so heavily scrutinized right now is because it's two NATO allies, right? It's not an adversary threatening the sovereignty of a NATO ally. What has this conversation, the very existence of the questions, the type of questions I'm asking you, I think, done to the strength of NATO, if anything?
So I sort of take this back to, I've been in this career getting on for 30 years now, and NATO now is stronger, more relevant than it has been at any point in those 30 years. Now, obviously, a lot of that has come out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially since 2022. But when that happened in 2022, I don't think there are very many people who would have predicted that the alliance would have been as united, as strong, as determined over the past 4 years as it's been. And that hasn't just been on Ukraine, it's been more broadly. We've welcomed in Sweden, Finland. You see defence spending going up. So my view is that as I look back over, say, nearly 30 years in this career, NATO now is more united, stronger. There is more money, more investment going in than I think at any point in those preceding years.
I see you, Ambassador Miraillet, nodding your head. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Even I'm the French representative in this group. No, I fully agree to that. I fully agree to that. And
what gives you that impression? And I'll sort of, respectfully challenge, because I think from the outside, it looks like the fact that there's this conversation about what happens if one NATO ally, infringes on the sovereignty of another, can lead some to believe, well, what's going on with NATO? This in fact has a detrimental impact to the alliance as a whole. You don't believe that's the case?
Well, there's always a risk. You don't know what may happen, but when you look at the debates, as my British colleague said, I mean, within the alliance, in front of the major threat, which is, the conflict in Ukraine, I don't think that this is, as I told you before, it's a kind of family affair, more or less unpredictable. At the end of the day, the response of the Danes was very calm, very quiet, and you have a lot of experience behind that, For the moment, the Chinese or the Russian threats on the Greenland is not so clear, not so evident, it may be different in other places of the Northern Atlantic. But you need to prepare yourself. Greenland has been central for the detection of missiles, of nuclear deterrence for the United States. For the Golden Dome, it will have to play a role there. But the Treaty of 1951 offers all the capabilities, the capacities for the Americans to build what they want and to reinforce their position. One more time, they have around less than 200 people there for the moment. So, the image, it doesn't, for us, it's not, it can be a threat, and people are looking at it very seriously in Brussels, as well as in the capitals, to which extent we are, people in Moscow may rejoice, in front of that. I'm not sure, you know.
Ambassador Bellmann, the final word to you. Your assessment on what the existence of this conversation does to the strength of NATO.
Of course, you know, to just have this conversation and to have this concern of one ally in view of some of the messages that come out of Washington is not a position we want to be in. At the same time, I agree with my colleagues, it doesn't change the fact that in terms of the military substance, the posture we have, the determination to keep up our deterrence, to defend each other, there is no change I see there. I don't think this is the end of NATO or anything like that, some of the speculations that we've witnessed. And for us as policymakers and diplomats, the focus should be on trying to find a solution to this issue, invest in our strengths. We are dealing with the US administration that has been clear with regard to their expectations in terms of burden sharing and burden shifting. And at the same time, there is a clear threat in Europe that we all are facing that makes it in our own self-interest to invest much more in our defenses. And all of us are doing that. And I think this is what we should concentrate on.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you very much, High Commissioner and Ambassadors, for making the time for the conversation. I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to talk about how provinces are at odds over Mark Carney's deal in China. Our Sunday strategy session is here to talk about domestic political implications of that deal. Back in a moment.
Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs.
This was not thought out properly. It wasn't consulted. It was a knee-jerk reaction as far as I'm concerned. And this is going to be a big, big problem.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping is receiving mixed reviews here in Canada. Prairie premiers are welcoming the relief for their agricultural industries. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, though, is decrying the deal as terrible for his province's auto industry. Our Sunday strategy session is here. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and Director of Communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former Communications Director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you again. I guess it's very late to say Happy New Year, but it is our first meeting in the new year. Scott, I'll start with you. There were a lot of discussion about the political stakes of this trip heading into it, whether there would be any specific announcement. We obviously know now that there was a specific announcement related to tariff relief on both sides to a degree. When you think about the political cost benefit of all of that to the federal government, to the Prime Minister, what do you arrive at?
High stakes. All of this is very high stakes. I mean, this is a much larger than anticipated breakthrough on trade with China, I think, both in terms of the framework and the sweep of the framework, the 5 pillars that are outlined, and then obviously the action, the reciprocal action on tariff reductions on agricultural goods and Chinese EV autos. I mean, I am really quite taken by this. It shows that Carney is willing to take on political risk. Political risk, and obviously Scott Moe, from Saskatchewan, is going to be pleased with this. Doug Ford immediately voicing his displeasure. But also political risk in terms of how does this work vis-a-vis the United States? What does this do? And from my reading of it, Carney is making a bet here. And Carney's bet is that this will strengthen his hand in CUSMA discussions. Because you'll be able to go into Ford and say, go into Trump and say, like, you may regard the importation of EV vehicles as something that bothers you, but unless you want to see that schedule accelerated, then you're going to have to give a little, not just take. And it may strengthen our hand at that table. On the other hand, Donald Trump is an unpredictable bear, and so he may just erupt and roar. We'll have to wait and see. But clearly, Carney is willing to roll some dice, take some chances, and make some moves. This is a pretty bold outcome.
Were you surprised, Kory, at the sort of specificity, the scope of what was arrived at? Because the expectation setting ahead of the trip was not that there would be this sort of quid pro quo, which ended up materializing.
Well, perhaps for the first time in the history of this government, they lowered expectations and then overachieved on them, which is quite the opposite of what they have done in a number of circumstances in the past. Yeah, I'm a bit surprised. I think the politics of this, within Canada are problematic for Carney. The parts of the country that grow canola, and including my own family's farm, are pretty solidly conservative, and there's no indication that that's ever going to change. And the places that produce automobiles that are going to be hammered by this agreement are swing seats, each and every one of them. So and there are a lot of them. So I think the politics of it could be challenging for Carney.
It's interesting because when we talk about the concept of political risk, as Kory was detailing that, it reminded me it's the second time we've basically had that conversation. The MOU was the first, right?
Right.
Essentially, like, what do you politically have to gain from an agreement that favors Alberta in Saskatchewan, or in this case, Saskatchewan in Manitoba, where you have nowhere near the electoral calculation that you would in Ontario?
Yeah, but in this one, he's evaluating his trips both to China and his upcoming trip to India. He's trying to signal to Trump, if you're not going to make a deal with us, we will sell our products elsewhere. But it's going to come at a risk. You know what I mean? And the thing is that industrial strategy is two things. It's industrial and it's also strategy. And I worry that, Carney is betting on a promise that the Chinese will invest in our auto sector in the next 3 years. But we've heard those promises before. And auto workers in Ontario basically, don't live and don't feed their families on promises. They don't, a wing and a prayer is not enough for industrial strategy. People live paycheck to paycheck. They don't live on talking points that are like, for 2030, we're going to have these investments, or 2035, we're going to have these investments in our auto industry. And sure, there are some guardrails that the Canadian government have put into this agreement with China, but are they enough? Are we getting enough? And actually, will the investment come? And I think, we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, the investments, Stellantis, Honda, you name it, Northvolt, some of those have worked out, others have not. But the one way to ensure that they're not going to work out is by, dumping a bunch of potentially Chinese EVs and getting China to have a foothold in our Ontario-based auto sector. I'll just add one more quick thing if I can. I think that Carney's largely betting on the fact that Canadians generally, their sentiment towards China has changed. 4 or 5 years ago, Canadians were angry with China. Now, Canadians are more angry with the U.S., right? And I think that is giving him the allowance to make this deal now. Sure, he's also getting a lot of great stuff for farmers and our fishers, our fish harvesters, you name it. But I think it's basically the fact that Canadian sentiment has changed so much since the hostage crisis, the hostage diplomacy, the 2 Michaels, all that stuff that happened 4 or 5 years ago to where we are today, and the real anger people are feeling towards the States.
The key, though, from a sort of crassly political perspective, will be if that remains the case, Scott, right? Because it changes quickly when they kidnap our citizens, or they, try to invade Taiwan. Like, there are lots of controversial things that could still happen that could swing that public sentiment.
No question. Carney's assuming risk here, and he's assuming risk by having to deal more closely with a regime that has demonstrated flatly that it can't be trusted. But I think that Carney's also, taking the fundamental calculation. And there are raw electoral politics to be considered here, like how's this going to play in St. Thomas and Oakville, of course. But I think his broader analysis is, I've got to figure out this relationship with the United States. And by saying we're going to permit some EVs in and the possibility of many more, that gives him something to take off the table with Donald Trump if Donald Trump is willing to deal. And when Donald Trump holds a press conference and says, Cushman's irrelevant to me, Canada has nothing I want, go fish. I think that Carney's left with a view that, well, let's call this bluff. Let's start to integrate more with China. And he's going to do the same when it comes to India and with Brazil. And the message will be, let's do a deal, or fine, if you're going to shut the drawbridge closed between Canada and the United States, we will have no choice but to deal with these regimes, however dangerous, however risky, and sometimes however unpalatable that might be.
It's one of the first examples, though, jumping off Scott's point, Kory, where the Prime Minister has done something that could ruffle the bear in Trump, right? In most instances, actually, it's run counter to the messaging during the campaign, and he's done a lot of stuff that you didn't think that they would do in order to take down the temperature. Why on this front do you think the calculation was to do something differently?
I'm not entirely sure. to be honest, Vassy, because I think this is a very bad deal for Canada. If China was investing in the auto sector and making Chinese EVs in Canada, I think that's a threat to Trump. But exactly zero vehicles from our auto sector are sold in China. So when Kathleen says, well, if the U.S. doesn't want our products and we'll sell them someplace else, that's not what's happening here. China is selling subsidized vehicles with stolen IP into our market, which will put at risk our access to the U.S. market, where we do sell a lot of vehicles. And so, the fuzzy end of the lollipop is what Doug Ford and the auto workers in Ontario are getting with this deal. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. So and I don't think it's particularly going to upset Trump. I think Trump doesn't like anyone doing anything with China, but the threat of importing some vehicles into the Canadian market is not the kind of threat that having a Canadian auto manufacturing plant that is Chinese owned producing Chinese vehicles. Now that is actually a threat. That's not what's happening.
Kathleen, last word to you.
Yeah, I don't think that actually Kory and I are saying anything different. I think this is a real concern for Canadian auto workers and for, in fact, our entire auto production manufacturing in Ontario. I think that really when we're looking at this industrial strategy, Carney's making a big bet, and one thing that we noted in the early reads of the agreement is that the auto and the EV importation deal goes for 5 years, whereas the agricultural deal is much shorter. So to use Kory's analogy, the fuzzy end of the lollipop might just be it, right? Like it might not be the good, tasty part. And I'm concerned because this could spell the death nail of our auto industry, which is something that Ontario cannot afford. And that goes back to my original point. Industrial strategy has to be a strategy, long term. Can't be just writing big checks. Can't just be promises on a wing and a prayer. It has to be more than that if we want our workers in our province working.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, Scott. I know, Scott, you don't. I have 30 seconds if you want to rebut it. I have 30 seconds if you want to rebut it.
I'll tell you what. I don't really agree with either Kathleen or Kory. I think that Carney's making a bet. It's not about investment in plants. I'm not even sure he wants that, to be honest. He wants to scare Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Donald Trump wants to kill the auto sector already. This way he can say, listen, if you want to see North America through the back door in Canada flooded with cheaper but better EVs, well, then we're going to have to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have to breathe some life into the auto sector and CUSMA. I think that's the bet he's making.
Can Trump be scared? I'm going to leave it on that note because good luck answering the question. Thanks, guys. Our Sunday strategy session, Kory Teneycke, Scott Reid, and Kathleen Monk. When we come back, more on this story. One of the 2 men detained by China for more than 1,000 days, Michael Kovrig, will be here to react to the Prime Minister's reset with China. We're back in just a moment.
Prime Minister, less than a year ago, you said that China was the biggest security threat to Canada. Do you still believe that?
The security landscape continues to change, and in a world that's more dangerous and divided, we face many threats. That's the reality, and the job, my responsibilities as Prime Minister, the job of the government, is to manage those threats.
Welcome back. We continue our coverage today of a very significant set of agreements Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed with China to counter Donald Trump's trade war on Canada. The Prime Minister says the agreements signal a reset in Canada-China relations that were significantly and negatively impacted when China arbitrarily detained 2 Canadian citizens for more than 1,000 days between 2018 and 2021. One of them is Michael Kovrig, and he's with us now. Hi, Mr. Kovrig. Good to see you, and welcome back to the program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks, Vassy. It's good to be here again.
I wanted to start off, just on your initial reaction to what was announced to kind of conclude this trip by the Prime Minister on tariffs.
You're talking specifically about electric vehicles, right?
Correct.
So it's huge news. There's no question. It was one of the scenarios that I had considered possible, but I didn't think they would go quite that far. So look, this deal is not just about tariffs, right? It's a strategic trade-off with long-term implications because China didn't just suddenly become more reasonable, right? It's a reaction to the world situation, and what it demonstrates to the Chinese Communist Party is pressure worked, and Beijing will remember that.
Yeah, what precedent ultimately could that set?
So look, let's look at it this way. What did Canada gain from this, right? Canadian farmers got real short-term relief, especially on canola. That's great. You know, you do need to you need to free the hostages, and so there needed to be some way of releasing some of that pain, and that matters. Those tariffs were painful and politically targeted, but the relief is time-limited and reversible, right? Beijing kept the leverage. What did Canada give up? Canada broke ranks with the U.S. on Chinese electric vehicles. Even with quotas, the signal's big. Market access is negotiable under pressure. And so that teaches the Chinese Communist Party that pressure works, and it's likely to test that again. As for how Beijing sees this, the CCP is going to see that Canada is flexible under economic pain, and so strategic partnership here isn't just about trying to build trust. In fact, it's mostly not about that. It's about training expectations. And this is China saying, this is how problems get solved. You accommodate, we reward. And that's really challenging. It has huge implications for Canada's industrial policy, for example.
Does it make things trickier with the United States?
Absolutely, it's a very serious challenge with the United States, right? I mean, when in general, when Canada talks about diversification, and as you know, I'm a big advocate that Canada needs to diversify trading partners and do things differently, right? But Canada cannot trade its way out of its security dependence on the United States. And replacing U.S. dependence with China dependence would be worse, not better, in so many ways. Regardless of what your warm feelings are, or how you feel about Donald Trump, replacing Washington as a major partner in any respect with China is going to put you in a situation where Washington can apply much more leverage and pain on Canada if Canada drifts too far out of bounds. And so the risk is not just Trump's reaction; it's also a structural risk. Canada's economy is deeply integrated with the United States, especially the auto sector. Rob Ford, every automaker in Canada has talked about this. Doug Ford has talked about a lot of this. And any perception that Canada is weakening allied coordination with China is likely to create downstream costs for the broader Canada-U.S. relationship, right? And so it's a real risk. Also long-term economically. My understanding of the United States situation is it's likely to revert back to being more engageable for Canada in the future. Give it time. But economically, China is not going to generate a more sustainable trade balance with Western countries. Its trajectory is inherently imbalanced. It's not going to get better.
Why is that the case?
It has to do with the structure of the Chinese economy and the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has certain ideological pathologies about production, right? It's obsessed with production. Xi Jinping, it calls itself a socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it's not even remotely socialist. It's state capitalist, and its priorities are to dominate the commanding heights of technology and manufacturing and industry in the 21st century. It's all right out there, and it's Made in China 2025 and other policy plans. And so it funnels huge amounts of capital and resources into manufacturing, which leads to vicious internal competition, which means Chinese manufacturers can't make profits at home much, and they produce way too much, and they need to export much more. And that creates this vicious cycle that they can't get out of economically. I had some hopes that Mark Carney, of all people, could try to talk them into changing their economic model, a very faint hope. And as long as that model continues, China is going to continue having massive export surpluses that it needs to dump into other markets, forcing those markets to restrict those exports. Meanwhile, its property sector is in the tank, and many other aspects of the Chinese economy are badly stagnating and are heading into a Japan-style lost decade. So they have so many economic problems, and they're effectively exporting them to Canada and other countries.
At many points in advance and during this trip, the federal government's framing around it has been one of sort of economic pragmatism and necessity vis-a-vis the treatment of us by the United States, the trade treatment of us by the United States. But there were moments during the trip where the Prime Minister appeared to take things further, including during meetings with the President and other top officials in China, where he even sort of surmised about a new world order. And that certainly caught the attention of some people in the U.S., but also many people in Canada. What did you make of that?
I thought that was a very worrisome way to express things, frankly. Look, diplomacy is necessary. Likewise, Mark Carney standing and grinning when shaking Xi Jinping's hand. That's not very comfortable for someone like me to see. Diplomacy is necessary. Grinning is optional, and looking like a supplicant is undignified. That's not a good look. So the optics could have been better. And talking about a refreshed strategic partnership while intoning about a new world order while you're sitting in a meeting room with the Chinese Communist Party really carries some very Orwellian overtones. And I think it risks, rather than trying to acknowledge realities, actually endorsing and supporting narratives that are deeply problematic and dangerous, right? It's a deeply unsettling message, and it's a very dangerous game. Mark Carney in general seems to be kind of following the Australian playbook of emphasizing trade and business and not talking about security. That can work for a while, but only if you still quietly take increasingly robust measures to defend your country, and you can't stay silent forever because that undermines confidence of allies, and it doesn't let the Canadian public understand the real risks that they're being drawn into with these kind of arrangements.
I'll leave it on that note. Thank you, Mr. Kovrig. I appreciate it as always.
Thank you.
When we come back, the 3 things I'll be watching for this week. Stay right there. We've got more question period just ahead. Welcome back to Question Period. Here are the 3 things I'll be watching for this week. Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump will meet for the first time since that FIFA draw at the beginning of December, this time in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum. We'll also be watching for inflation data from December, which comes at the beginning of this week. And then finally, the Federal Court of Appeal has ruled that the federal government under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act to clear protesters in the convoy demonstration was unreasonable. So we'll be looking to any political fallout from that decision. I will leave our first question period of the year there. Thank you so much for watching. We look forward to being with you throughout 2026. I'm Vassy Kapelos. I'll see you tomorrow on Power Play. Have a wonderful rest of your day.